Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at CSS Grid. So the things we're going to be covering today are what CSS Grid is, we're going to look at a code demonstration in CSS, and then we're going to look at some of the common CSS properties that you're going to use quite frequently with CSS Grid. Okay, so in front of me I have an example layout of a possible homepage for a website. Up top here we have a navigation bar. We have a main section, we have the sidebar, we have the footer. Now to get this sort of layout in CSS without some sort of grid system like CSS Grid, it would be very hard. So that's what CSS Grid does for us. It allows us to create layouts for our web page quite easily. Now you'll notice that I have some dimensions on the page here. So we have 100 pixels here, which is specifying the height I want of the nav bar. We have auto here, which means the main section will only be as tall as it needs to be. It will encapsulate all of its text. I want the width of the main section to only be 80%, and then over here for the sidebar, I want this to be 20% in width. So this will take up the entirety of the page. And then for the footer, like the nav bar, it takes up 100% of the page, but it's only 50 pixels tall. So we can also look at this as the rows and columns. We have row 1 here, row 2 here, and row 3 here. Column 1 and column 2. So this nav bar takes up all of row 1 and all of column 1 and column 2. This main section is in row 2 and column 1. This sidebar is in row 2, column 2. And this footer is in column 1 and 2, but row 3. So let's see how we can take these dimensions in this layout and code it in CSS Grid. Okay, so here I am in Visual Studio Code. I have an index.html file, and I have a style.css file. I've linked them both up with this link tag right here, and I removed all the margin and the padding from this page. So the first thing I want to do to get started is make a container that will hold our entire project. We'll name this class container grid. And inside that container, we want to define another div for each one of these sections. So if we go back to our layout here, we'll notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different sections. So the first section is our nav bar, so I'll use the semantic nav tag for that. Next we have the main section. Next is the sidebar. And finally we have a footer. Okay, so that's all the HTML we need for today. Let's jump into our CSS file. And first we're going to tell the browser that this is a CSS Grid layout. So to do that, we can grab the main container and we can use the display property to display a grid. Next, we need to find out how many rows and columns we want. So if we look back at this, you'll notice we have 3 rows at 100 pixels, auto, and 50. And we have 2 columns at 80% and 20%. So back in the CSS, we can define the rows and columns by grid, template, and then you'll see we have columns and rows. So we'll start with rows, and again that was 100 pixels, space, auto, space, 50 pixels. Now you'll see we have a little bit of padding here. So this is 100 pixels, auto, so there's nothing here, and then 50 pixels. Next for the columns, we'll use grid, template, columns, and the columns were 80% and 20%. So that's all we need for the container. and you'll see it looks a little bit strange over here. That's because we haven't defined how much of each row and column each of these will take up, and we can do that inside each of the tags. Before I do that though, I'm going to give each of the tags a background color so we can kind of see a little better what space they're taking up. Okay, so now we can see a little better what space they're taking up. And if we go back and if I erase this code here, you'll see that it's just standard with nothing one after the other. Okay, so let's start with the nav tag. Okay, so if we look at the nav bar, we already specified that we want it to be 100 pixels tall and 100% in width. So what we need to do is say that we want the nav bar to take up one row and two columns. If we look right now, it is taking up one row, but only one column. Okay, so to tell the browser where we want each row and column to start and end, we can use 4 different properties: grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. So we'll start with the row. Grid row start. And we just want this to start in row 1, so we'll simply put 1. Perfect. Next, we want to say where we want to end. So like grid row start, we'll do grid row end. And here, you may be thinking we want to end in row 1, but for the end property, it really takes the one above where we want to end. So we want to end in 1, we need to write 2 here. So it's saying stop before row 2. So it starts in row 1 and ends in row 2, but it doesn't get to row 2. So it's a little confusing, but it makes sense once you kind of think about it a little bit. Okay, now moving on to grid column. So grid column start. We want to start in column 1. And we want to take up column 1 and column 2. So we want to end in column 3, or right before column 3. Okay, so let's specify that. Grid column end and 3. Perfect. Now our nav bar is 1 row and 2 columns wide. And if we change this to 2, you'd see that it would end in column 1, so that wouldn't work. So that's why you need to go 1 up. Okay, perfect. Now we're going to be using this same technique for each of them. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this. Let's move on to the main section. Now the main section, we want it to take up 1 row and 1 column. So let's paste those in here. So we don't want to start in row 1, we want to start in row 2. And we want to end in row 2 as well, but remember we have to go 1 up. And we do want to start in column 1, and we don't want it to end in column 2 because remember we want room for a sidebar. So we're going to put 2 here instead of 3, and that way it will only take up 1 row and 1 column. Alright, let's move on to the sidebar. Now the sidebar will take up 1 row as well. That will be row 2, and it will take up 1 column, which will be column 2. Starts in row 2, ends in row 2, remember 1 up. It starts in column 2 as well, and ends in column 2, but remember specify 1 up, so 3 is correct there. Okay, so now the nav, the main, and the aside are all correct. Now we just have to fix this footer and make it spread throughout the entire width. To do that, let's paste our styles in again. And let's go back to here. Now we don't want to start in row 1 or 2, but row 3. So grid row start 3, grid row end, remember 1 up from 3, 4, because we want to stay in the same one. And then grid column start 1, and grid column end, we want to fit all 2 columns, so 1 up from 2 is 3. And you'll see that we are done. And if I resize the browser, it stays in the grid format, because remember, this is percent, so this will be 80% of the total browser width, and this will be 20. This will all be 100 pixels, this will be 50. Okay, so this works, but writing 4 lines each time is kind of tedious. So we can actually simplify this to a 1-line expression by combining all 4 of these values. So that's going to be the property grid area. And grid area will take in each of these separated by a slash. So it starts with grid row start, then it goes to grid column start, then grid row end, then grid column end. So this one will be 1, 1, 2, 3. All separated by a slash. 1, 1, 2, 3. Now we can get rid of this. And you'll see nothing changed. We can do the same for all of them. So this will be 2, 1, 3, 2. Perfect. This will be 2, 2, 3, 3. And this will be 3, 1, 4, 3. There we go. Nothing changed, but we now only have 1 line instead of the 4. So let me change the main section here just to show you that this will adjust with whatever's in there. So since I'm in Visual Studio Code, I can get dummy text by writing lorem and then a number after it, and then hitting enter. That'll give me 50 words of dummy text. And you'll see this now increased in size because it needs to fit everything. So that's the basics of CSS Grid. And in my experience, that's really all I've needed to use. Alright, so that is a basic introduction to CSS Grid, and we will use this as well as other HTML and CSS properties in the next video to start developing a website from scratch. Thanks for watching.